Hello YouTube, Warbles on a lot here, with a little bit of a rave on anti-natalism and anti-natalists. Now, 6 months ago I'd never heard of anti-natalism or anti-natalists, and it come as a bit of a shock to me to realise that there are people who are campaigning against having births, right? Now, it's got a bit of a history. It goes back to a fella called Schopenhauer, and he decided in the 1700s that life was not worth living, and various other people have championed the cause. A fella called David Benatar wrote a book that most anti-natalists that I've spoken to on YouTube seem to quote at some point or refer to at some point or another. And this Benatar has 4 premises, right? Now, premise 1 is that suffering is bad. Premise 2 is the absence of suffering is good. Premise 3, a little bit more ambiguous, is that to prevent the suffering of a hypothetical non-existent being by stopping them from being conceived, that's good, right? Premise 4 is even more contentious, is to prevent the hypothetical being, non-existent, from perceiving joy or pleasure by stopping them from being conceived. That is not bad, okay? So if you prevent a non-existent being from suffering, that's good. If you prevent the non-existent being from experiencing joy, that's not bad. So, most people in the world who are not depressed consider that joy and pleasure are at least equal to suffering in importance, and in terms of how much time you spend in your life perceiving joy and suffering, or at least not perceiving pain and suffering, then pain and suffering is a fairly small proportion of life. It's certainly not the dominant perception of life, which is one of the assumptions of the anti-natalists, all right? Now, the anti-natalists are so convinced that life is dominated by suffering that one of them suggested recently on the comment thread that even on farms, when they've got people doing their best to look after them, then animals can't be spending any less than 50% of their time suffering. And you reckon that it would be far worse for their cousins living in the wild with nobody looking out for them. And I just thought, excuse me, Fred, what the fuck are you dreaming of? Now, let's take, for example, a kangaroo, all right? Over there we have Kevin, the kangaroo. Now he's 2.5 years old, and when he was born, he was about the size of the end joint of my little finger, and he had to climb his way up and get into the pouch and lock onto the teat. And once he was in there, he had 7 weeks where he was being fed and sheltered and kept warm and cuddled, and he had skin-to-skin contact with his mother, and he was completely safe, and life was just blissful. And after the first 3 or 4 weeks, when his eyes opened, he could put his head out and have a look around, and life was really interesting, all right? And then after 7 weeks or 49 days, he could suddenly come out of the pouch and start doing time trials, and as well as being fed and sheltered and cuddled and all the rest of it, he could now go exploring. He could run off 25 yards and come back and have a drink of mother's milk. And run off 25 yards, come back and have another drink. Run off 20 or 30 yards and do a circle around her and come back, jump back inside and have a sleep for a bit. Right? It was just joyful. Now the sad fact is about half the joeys that get out of the pouch die before the first week. Right? Because they get eaten by a fox. Because they're too slow, and their mother has to run away to stop her getting eaten by a fox, and the joey just gets eaten. And they might be suffering for 5 minutes while the fox chases them and bites them and kills them. 5 minutes, right? And some people would say, oh, what a horrible, cruel, terrible, unfair world where when they're only 8 weeks old they get killed and all that pain and suffering, and that's obviously the dominant sensation in their life. And I've got to say, no, that's bullshit. That's 5 minutes of pain and suffering at the end of 8 weeks of absolute bliss. It's a 16,128th of their life is pain and suffering. It's 0.006% of their life is pain and suffering. And if they make it to their first birthday and get hit by a car, it's an 86,000th of their life. 0.0009%, right? So really, they're having a great time. Oops, I lied. If they live for a year, it's 186,768th, which is 0.00103% of their life is pain and suffering at 1 year. All right? Now, Kevin over there, he's 2.5 years old. Right? Most of his life, he's been perfectly calm and satisfied and happy and comfortable with enough to drink and enough to eat, and nobody hassles him. He eats out of my hand and sniffs the camera lens. Out there in the sheep farm, I admit, life is more miserable because, let's say, we take account of the dogs that get set on the sheep every time the farmer wants to move them. That's their ancestral enemies. That's got to be frightening. We take account of being made to swim in poison. It's called dipping them, so they don't get lice and die from lice. Drenching them, making them drink poison so they don't get worms and flukes. Shearing them, steal their coat in the middle of winter so that they'll be stimulated to grow more wool for next year. Performance called crutching them, where the farmer turns them upside down and shears the wool off their arse so they don't get fly strike and die of maggot infestations. And some farmers, they mules them, which is to scalp their arsehole, so that it'll turn into shiny scar tissue and never grow wool there again for prevention of fly strike. So a sheep, if it lives for only 8 weeks, okay, maybe it's spent 1/1000th of its time suffering. That's 16 times worse of a life than a kangaroo in the wild. If it lives for a year, it's maybe 1/10,000th of its life has been spent suffering. It's by no way the dominant feature of its life is suffering. I don't know what it's like for a chook in a battery farm, or a pig in an intensive piggery in a barn, or a cow in a feedlot, but you're still not going to drive the amount of suffering in the life of an animal up or above 1 part in 100, right? Because suffering is relative, even for humans. If your life is so deprived that the best thing in it is having a warm pair of felt slippers to put your feet in the morning and getting an extra half a bowl of porridge for breakfast before you have to walk miles through the snow and make cement bricks, then your life is well, it's like Ivan Denisovich in the novel by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And that's what his life was about. 5 minutes of pleasure and bliss from having a warm pair of boots. Absolute delirium of pleasure because there's an extra half a bowl of porridge. So what you think makes you miserable might make somebody else wildly happy. And then there's memory editing. Nobody ever remembers exactly the pain of childbirth, or of passing a kidney stone, or of any other physical pain. Right? It gets cut out and edited. So, all in all, the idea that the dominant perception of life is suffering, and that in order to prevent suffering being perceived you have to have no life, it's a wild overreaction. It's a baby with the bathwater reaction. And I can't accept that it's anything other than a function of a depressed state of mind, where the individual is already depressed, everything that they see around them makes them feel miserable, and they run across a philosophy that says there's no point in life, there should be nobody else born. Right? I'm fairly sure that I think I'm normal, and anybody who varies from my viewpoint is increasingly abnormal. It's a common feature of the human condition to project your normality out onto the rest of the world. So people who are depressed, they think that they are normal, and they think that it is normal to be depressed, and they think that everybody else in the world sees just the same kind of despair-filled, depressing view of the universe. So they're being very selfless in saying that they don't want to have any children and inflict misery and suffering on the world. They're being kind of rude when they say that because they are depressed and miserable, therefore everybody else should share the viewpoint that life is not worth living, and thus and because nobody should have any children. Their aim is to have no life in the universe, because the possibility of life involves the certainty of perceiving suffering, and they think suffering is all important. Now, I think it's pretty rude, It's like saying to somebody, oh, you had a marvellous life for X number of years and then you were raped, and afterwards you had a hard time getting over the rape, but you had all these other things that you did and you were pleased about, but nothing matters except the rape, because you are defined by the rape. That 5 minutes of suffering is predominant to everything else that happened. It's really rude to appropriate and I would say misappropriate somebody else's suffering in order to make a debating point to shore up your position that there shouldn't be anybody born because you're miserable. And it's kind of where anti-natalism seems to be coming from. It's hyper-nihilism is what I see anti-natalism. And there again, we're going to get into a bit of dispute. A lot of anti-natalists have suggested that nihilism means nothing matters, and that's absolutely wrong. Nihilism is the idea of reducing everything to nothing. That's what the French nihilistic philosophers taught Pol Pot, and that's why Pol Pot tried to reduce everything to nothing when he went bananas with the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, right? That's why he burnt everybody's right shoe and stockpiled their left shoe in a warehouse, and he killed anybody who had any education. All the teachers and scientists, he got rid of all of them. He moved everybody out of the cities and into the jungle because he was reducing everything to nothing. And after reducing it to nothing, Pol Pot thought you could rebuild and get a better world. The anti-natalists don't want to rebuild. They are hyper-nihilists, right? Which is pretty sad, you know. They're also very sensitive people who don't want to see suffering in the world, and they're prepared to have no kids in order to further that end. So, yeah, I don't agree with them, but I understand where they're coming from, and I like them. Took me a while to like them because I thought they would be dangerous for people who were depressed to be exposed to, on the grounds that they would be pretty much counselling towards suicide. And I'm one of the people who is very glad not to have committed suicide when I was 21 and seriously thinking about it and sucking on a gun barrel. And you know, I'm also somebody who's had a stepson hang himself, and you know, I wish he hadn't done that. And I think an awful lot of people who've got kids are terrified that the kid might be exposed to somebody who counsels towards killing himself. Here we have the local white-winged chuffs. They're eating a burger ring, making a communal feast of it. Yeah. Look, see, you've got a big bit of burger ring. Now, those birds would just laugh in your face at the idea that life is nothing but suffering when living in the wild. They have a marvellous life. They really enjoy themselves. Yeah, so even though I like the anti-natalists, I understand where they're coming from. I don't agree with them. I think it's not a coherent philosophy. It's a counsel of despair, and I think it's pretty well wrong. I think to a very large degree anti-natalism is underpinned by atheism, and atheism is a belief that there is no God. It's totally different from agnosticism, which is no belief in any God. Atheism is a belief that there's no God, and because there's no God there can't be any point to life, and because there's no God and no point to life there can't be any, you know, karmic payback or cosmic scoreboard effect. So atheists tend to find life pretty depressing, and it's a cause for despair. Personally, I had kids due to my own conceit, to the effect that my DNA is good for living here, right? I mean, since 1882, when my father's grandfather showed up around here, my DNA has been living within 50 miles of where I'm sitting at the moment. And there's not too many people on the planet who can say that anymore. I know that there's too many people on the planet, and I know that most people are selfish, deluded psychotics, and they're headed down a silly track. And I like to think that I have raised my kids not to be fuckwits, and I'm pleased that I've had kids. And I think that my children make humanity as a whole a less depressing mob of individuals, because my kids are not stupid and they're not fuckwits. And that's one reason for having kids, is if you think that there's reason to be conceited. And one of the funny things is that the way to spiritual advancement, according to the religious beliefs that I hold, One of the best ways of spiritually advancing yourself is to have no kids, right, and dedicate your life to the generation already here. So the anti-natalists probably look pretty good in the eyes of God. Ciao.